The putrid, eye-watering stench of rotting meat and stagnant swamp water filled the confined, sweltering space of the treehouse. It was so potent, it made my brother violently vomit over the railing. The strange boy just smiled at us, his jaw unhinging slightly too far, revealing teeth that were jagged and impossibly long. Story 1. The Gray Woman of the Mission District. My name is Alex. If you know anything about the San Francisco housing market, you know that finding a decent, affordable place to live is practically a supernatural miracle in itself. A few years ago, my friend Sarah and I managed to score apartment 3F, located deep within the densely populated, historically vibrant Mission District. The neighborhood was loud, chaotic, and always moving. Our building was an ancient, towering Victorian remnant that had somehow survived the city's rapid waves of gentrification. The apartment itself became our ultimate sanctuary. It wasn't some derelict, abandoned cabin in the woods. It was a highly active, bustling social hub for our entire friend group. We were in our late 20s, navigating the exhausting grind of city life. And apartment 3F essentially functioned as a home away from home for everyone we knew. Guests frequently gathered on weekends, crashing on our oversized couches after long, ridiculous nights out hopping between dive bars. The domesticity of the space was its greatest comfort. It felt incredibly warm, loud, and alive. We had modern deadbolts on the heavy wooden doors to keep out the unpredictable dangers of the San Francisco streets. And we genuinely believed we were completely safe inside those walls. But the absolute horror of apartment 3F was exponentially magnified by that exact feeling of safety. The sanctuary of our lively, welcoming apartment was quietly, intimately compromised by a deeply embedded, invasive presence. For years, the physical space silently absorbed our terror, while we inadvertently created a strict, unspoken code of silence regarding the roommate that didn't pay rent. The haunting didn't start with flying plates or demonic voices. It started as a chronic, heavy sensation of observation, primarily localized to the bedrooms. I first noticed it on a random Tuesday night. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when my heavy silver necklace, which was resting flat on my wooden dresser across the room, inexplicably lifted an inch into the air and dropped to the floor with a sharp clink. I tried to blame it on the vibrations from a passing garbage truck, but the suffocating, oppressive sensation of being intently watched from the dark, liminal corners of my bedroom became a nightly occurrence. It felt like standing on the edge of a cliff in the pitch dark. My body constantly dumped adrenaline into my system for no logical reason. But Sarah, the primary leaseholder, was enduring something far worse. She started looking severely exhausted, her eyes sunken with deep, dark bags. She became incredibly hesitant to sleep in her own room, frequently opting to pass out on the living room sofa. When I finally cornered her and asked what was going on, she looked at me with a primal, terrified expression. She confessed that a corporeal presence was manifesting in the dead of night, standing silently over her bed, just watching her sleep. It wasn't a translucent shadow. It had physical mass. The manifestations rapidly evolved. The entity began routinely crawling into the bed alongside her, applying undeniable physical weight to the mattress. The springs would creak. The blankets would pull tight. Despite the mind-altering terror of these nocturnal encounters, Sarah maintained a remarkably strict policy of absolute silence. Her hesitation to speak about it was a superstitious defense mechanism. She fundamentally believed that acknowledging the entity verbally, or giving it emotional attention, would directly feed it and inevitably increase its power. So, we all suffered in silence, pretending the apartment wasn't actively rotting our sanity. The psychological pressure of this unrelenting, silent terror eventually reached a breaking point for me. I was exhausted, paranoid, and losing my grip on reality. One night, the oppressive feeling in my bedroom was so suffocating, I physically could not breathe. Eschewing Sarah's strategy of silent endurance, I opted for aggressive territorial reclamation. I sat up in bed, my heart hammering violently against my ribs, stared into the pitch-black corner of the room, and screamed at the top of my lungs, "Get out!" Strangely enough, this direct, furious, highly emotional confrontation actually worked. The heavy atmosphere instantly vanished. The raw assertion of my human boundaries temporarily repelled the encroachment, but the victory was agonizingly brief and localized only to my room. By banishing it from my space, I had inadvertently pushed the entity out into the common areas of the apartment, directly into the path of our completely unaware guests. The dam of collective denial finally broke on a cold Saturday morning in November. Michelle Newman, a member of our social circle and a frequent overnight guest, experienced an undeniably physical manifestation of the entity. Michelle had returned to the apartment alone at approximately 2:30 a.m. after attending a late-night comedy show downtown. The apartment was completely dark and dead silent. Michelle kicked off her shoes and walked casually into the small galley kitchen to grab a glass of water from the tap. As she turned toward the sink, she found herself standing completely face to face, less than 2 feet away from the apparition. Michelle's testimony provided the most vivid, chillingly mundane, and highly detailed description of the entity, which we retroactively dubbed the Grey Woman. The apparition was entirely corporeal, possessing solid mass to the human eye, standing at direct eye level under the faint glow of the streetlights filtering through the window. She had frizzy, unkempt hair and wore a faded gray cardigan sweater, a drab gray skirt, and distinctly sensible, rubber-soled shoes. The absolute banality of the spirit's attire is what elevated the terror of the encounter. There were no flowing white Gothic gowns or rattling chains. It was a stark, terrifying realism. It looked like an ordinary, working-class woman from the mid-20th century. Michelle reported that the entity appeared just as startled by the sudden, unexpected human encounter as she was. Following a brief, agonizing moment of mutual, paralyzed shock in the kitchen, the Grey Woman simply vanished. Just a silent blip, and she was entirely gone. Michelle's visceral encounter effectively shattered our unspoken embargo. Once the taboo was lifted, a floodgate of repressed trauma opened. It was swiftly revealed that the haunting wasn't isolated. At least 6 other independent friends, many of whom were tangential acquaintances who had never even spoken to each other about the paranormal, came forward with precisely matching testimonies. They reported fleeting glimpses of the Grey Woman darting through the kitchen, intense corner-of-the-eye sightings in the narrow hallway, and the recurring visual of the woman standing silently by the sink at 2 a.m. The overarching theme of Apartment 3F is the absolute fragility of the domestic sanctuary. The physical deadbolts successfully kept out the tangible dangers of the city, but they were entirely useless against the roommate that already lived permanently inside the walls. The act of a stranger in sensible shoes silently crawling into a young woman's bed taps into a universal human vulnerability that no amount of urban bustling can cure. We broke the lease 2 months later. We left the city, but the memory of the Grey Woman standing in the dark continues to haunt every apartment I have lived in since. This first-hand account was sourced from a collection of documented urban hauntings compiled by the San Francisco Paranormal Research Society website. The testimony was provided by Alex M., detailing events that occurred in the Mission District of San Francisco, California, between the dates of 2018 and 2021, eventually trending nationwide in 2026. Story 2, Liminal Echoes and Occupational Dread at the Old Rock Store. My name is Jordan, and working retail in Austin, Texas is already a nightmare of endless crowds and impossible heat. But my time at the old rock store fundamentally changed how I view reality. The building, currently operating as the Square Rut Kava Bar, is located right on US 290 in the bustling Oak Hill neighborhood. It is a formidable, imposing structure constructed entirely out of thick native Texas limestone well over a century ago. It has housed numerous wildly different businesses across the decades, most famously the Austin Pizza Garden. During the day, the Kava Bar is a vibrant, welcoming place explicitly designed for relaxation, sobriety, and intense socialization. Our boss, Tracy, is a fiercely dedicated owner who poured her heart into the business. The daytime shifts were exhausting but completely normal. You sling earthy kava drinks to college students, wipe down tables, and listen to indie music. However, this welcoming, earthy facade aggressively transforms into an oppressive, highly active paranormal hotspot the exact moment the front doors lock, the last customer leaves, and the main dining lights are killed for the night. For the staff, dealing with the supernatural wasn't a fun ghost hunting adventure. It was treated as a highly distressing, inescapable occupational hazard that simply had to be endured in order to secure a minimum wage paycheck. We called it occupational dread. The grinding psychological toll of clocking into a shift knowing you might be stalked by the unseen is exhausting. The red flags were subtle at first, but impossible to ignore. The manifestations within the thick limestone walls were highly varied and erratic, strongly indicating the permanent presence of multiple distinct entities rather than a single residual loop. The most prominent visual apparition was an entity known to the veteran staff and local historians as Rosa. Rosa was consistently and vividly described by my coworkers as a sorrowful, ethereal woman dressed entirely in an antique white wedding dress. She was most frequently seen silently watching the living from the vantage point of the upstairs loft or the interior balcony areas. Her visual appearances were highly sudden and completely silent. When you saw Rosa, she didn't invoke terror. She left you with a profound, contagious sense of sorrow and melancholy that lingered in your own mind long after her figure faded back into the limestone walls. We learned to just ignore her, treating her like a sad fixture of the architecture. But Rosa wasn't the only thing trapped in the old rock store, and the other entities were far less forgiving. The true escalation always occurred near the stairwells and the hidden, isolated back rooms of the century-old structure during the final closing procedures. I was tasked with mopping the back hallway one humid Tuesday night around 1 a.m. I was completely alone on the ground floor while Tracy was upstairs balancing the registers. As I pushed the mop bucket near the heavy wooden staircase, the ambient temperature plummeted violently. My breath hitched as a dense, towering shadow figure peeled itself away from the peripheral darkness of the hallway. This wasn't a mere trick of the ambient streetlight filtering through the windows. The shadow possessed a palpable, terrifying mass. It actively blocked the light, shifting like thick black smoke, and radiated a heavy, oppressive energy. I instantly suffered a massive panic attack. My chest tightened, causing extreme shortness of breath, and an overwhelming, irrational dread forced me to drop the mop handle and back away slowly. As I retreated, the auditory manipulations began. I clearly heard heavy, phantom footsteps echoing methodically on the wooden floorboards directly above my head, mimicking the pacing of a massive, heavy-booted man. But the most intimately terrifying moment happened a week later. I was wiping down the espresso machine in the front when I heard my own specific name called out. Jordan. It was clear, distinct, and whispered directly from the empty, darkened supply closet, deliberately attempting to lure me away from the safety of the illuminated main bar area. It sounded exactly like Tracy's voice, but I knew Tracy had already driven home for the night. I was completely alone in the building. I ran out of the back door that night, leaving the alarm unset, and sat in my locked car, shaking for an hour. The sheer virality of the old rock store haunting in 2026 is driven by this bizarre, deeply modern intersection of everyday retail commerce and ancient, unresolved trauma. Tracy and our barista staff found ourselves in a highly unique, terrifying position. We were legally, professionally, and financially tethered to a physical space that was actively and aggressively occupied by the dead. We couldn't just burn the building down or quit our jobs without facing severe financial ruin. The entities here, whether it be the grieving, eternal bride Rosa waiting in the loft, or the aggressive, territorial, towering shadows in the basement, were trapped in a permanent liminal loop, and they fiercely resented our presence. We weren't just mixing herbal drinks for the Austin nightlife. We were actively sharing our workspace with a permanent, invisible, and highly demanding clientele that utterly refused to vacate the premises after closing time. I eventually quit to save my own sanity, taking a lower-paying job just to avoid the night shift. But occasionally, when I am entirely alone in my new apartment, I still hear a voice that sounds exactly like my boss, whispering my name from the darkest corner of the room. This terrifying occupational account was submitted anonymously by a former employee to the True Austin Hauntings database. The events took place at the historic Old Rock Store, Square Rut Kava Bar, located at 6266 US 290 West Austin, Texas, spanning incidents from 2022 to the viral resurgence of the location in 2026. I have a question for you. The staff at the Old Rock Store were forced to share their workspace with towering shadow figures just to earn a paycheck. If your job suddenly became a paranormal hotspot, how much would they have to pay you to work the closing shift alone? Drop your exact price in the comments below. And if these human-centric horrors are keeping you on the edge of your seat, take 1 second to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode of Creepy Digest. Now, let's head into the woods, where a childhood sanctuary hides a foul-smelling secret. Story 3. The Orange-Eyed Boy of the Temecula Treehouse. My name is Hunter Peterson. When people discuss hauntings, they almost exclusively focus on man-made building interiors, apartments, old hospitals, or Victorian mansions. But my lifelong nightmare is deeply rooted in the natural, untamed outdoor environment of Temecula, California. Specifically, the terrifying phenomena centered entirely around the sun-drenched, sprawling, and ancient oak groves that surrounded my childhood home. The setting represented the absolute pinnacle of idyllic, suburban American youth. The vast oak groves were a massive natural playground for my older brother and me. During our long, unsupervised childhood explorations, we stumbled upon an old, forgotten, dilapidated wooden treehouse hidden incredibly deep within the thick canopy of the trees. Like many adventurous children seeking independence, we eagerly claimed the elevated space as our own. We spent weeks dragging up scrap wood and rusty nails, fixing up the rotting floorboards to serve as a secret hideout and a highly private sanctuary away from the adult world. The environment was inherently safe, deeply nostalgic, and intensely personal to us. The aggressive, supernatural corruption of this innocent childhood sanctuary completely shattered my reality and altered the trajectory of my entire life. The lifelong haunting didn't begin with a traditional bump in the night, a cold breeze, or a rattling chain. It began with a deeply unsettling, impossible physical intrusion into a highly confined space. It was the middle of a blazing hot July afternoon. My brother and I had climbed the wooden ladder and pulled ourselves into the treehouse, expecting to read comic books in the shade. Instead, a strange, completely unfamiliar little boy simply appeared inside the small wooden structure with us. He didn't climb the ladder. We didn't hear him approach through the dry, crunchy brush below. He was just suddenly sitting in the corner, staring at us. He didn't immediately present as a translucent, floating ghost or a horrific, recognizable cinematic monster. He appeared entirely as a human child wearing dirty, outdated denim overalls. But every single sensory output he generated was profoundly, deeply wrong. The sight of him triggered a massive, nauseating cognitive dissonance in my brain. It was a severe uncanny valley effect. His physical movements were disjointed, twitchy, and completely unnatural, like a poorly puppeteered marionette trying to mimic human breathing. When he finally opened his mouth, his speech patterns were highly erratic, nonsensical, and deeply unsettling. He didn't form actual words. He just emitted a series of clicking, overlapping, buzzing sounds that failed to mimic normal human cadence. The absolute terror of the situation escalated when the physical reality of the entity hit my other senses. Uniquely among the ghost stories I have researched since, this entity emitted a distinct, overwhelmingly foul odor. The introduction of extreme olfactory horror paralyzed me completely. In deep supernatural lore, phantom smells, particularly those associated with sulfur, rot, or decay, are historically and exclusively linked to deeply malevolent, potentially demonic entities rather than standard human residual spirits. The putrid, eye-watering stench of rotting meat and stagnant swamp water filled the confined, sweltering space of the treehouse. It was so potent, it made my brother violently vomit over the railing. The strange boy just smiled at us, his jaw unhinging slightly too far, revealing teeth that were jagged and impossibly long. The putrid stench severely traumatized us, creating a primal sensory anchor to the horror that merely closing our eyes could not cure. We scrambled down the ladder in a state of absolute, blind panic, leaving our belongings behind and sprinting through the oak groves until our lungs burned. We never went back to the treehouse, but the sheer terror of the entity did not end with the abandonment of the woods or the passing of my childhood. The most chilling, devastating aspect of my ordeal is the relentless, lifelong stalking perpetrated by the entity. After that initial, deeply traumatic encounter in the oak groves, the demonic boy seemingly attached himself biologically and spiritually directly to me. As I grew older and attempted to move away for college, the entity's manifestations evolved in tandem. The foul-smelling boy transitioned from a localized physical anomaly in a wooden treehouse to an omnipresent, inescapable parasite. Unlike ghosts bound to the physical geography of a haunted apartment or a historic limestone building, this entity is bound entirely to my person. The physical address of the haunting has simply moved wherever I have moved across the country. In my adulthood, I continue to be plagued by severe, debilitating visitations from the entity, which has long since shed its innocent, childlike facade. The presence now frequently manifests in the corners of my adult bedroom as a terrifying, towering, shadowy figure. Its most distinguishing feature is a pair of piercing, glowing orange eyes that stare at me with pure, unadulterated malice. This parasitic, highly dependent relationship implies a deep, predatory intelligence that specifically selected me as a host during a moment of profound childhood vulnerability in those isolated oak groves. It actively evolved its terrifying visage to maintain total psychological dominance and continuously harvest my fear as I matured. It brutally dismantled the ultimate protective barrier of childhood innocence, weaponizing a simple treehouse to trap its victim. You can move out of a haunted house, and you can quit a haunted job, but you can never, ever run away from a demon that lives inside your own shadow. This deeply disturbing, ongoing case of parasitic attachment was originally submitted by Hunter Peterson to the True Encounters Paranormal Registry website. The initial event took place in the rural oak groves of Temecula, California, in 2004. With the violent, evolutionary stalking continuing actively into the year 2026. If you found yourself stalked by an entity with glowing orange eyes, who would you call when the police can't help? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If these encounters made you check the locks on your doors tonight, hit that like button, subscribe to Creepy Digest, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Stay safe, trust your survival instincts, and whatever you do, never invite them in. Good night.